The first sign that something was terribly wrong in Lochdub came with the silence. Winter had sealed the Highlands in a white hush. Snow lay deep along the narrow road, swallowing footsteps and softening sound, and the loch itself stretched like black glass beneath a pale sky. By dawn, the village should have been alive with the usual small movement stores opening, kettles whistling, sheep bleating from distant crofts. But that morning, the silence felt heavy, watchful, as though the land itself were holding its breath. It was Mrs. Wellington who raised the alarm. She had trudged through the snow to deliver fresh scones to old Angus MacLeod, as she did every Thursday without fail. Angus had lived alone at the far edge of the village for nearly 20 years in a narrow stone cottage crouched against the wind. He was known for two things: his stubborn refusal to leave the Highlands and his habit of rising before anyone else. Yet that morning, smoke did not curl from his chimney. The door had been locked from the inside. Mrs. Wellington had knocked, called, even rattled the handle, but there had been no answer. The windows were shuttered. Snow lay smooth and untouched on the sill. A growing unease had sent her hurrying back to the village, cheeks flushed and breath sharp in the frozen air. By the time the constable arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside the cottage. The sky had darkened, clouds rolling low and grey, promising more snow. Hamish Macbeth stood slightly apart from the others, long legs folded awkwardly as he crouched to examine the ground. His cap was pulled low, and his expression carried the sleepy mildness that made strangers underestimate him, but his eyes were alert. "No footprints?" he asked quietly. "None," said Mrs. Wellington. "Not since yesterday. I would have seen." Hamish nodded. The snow was unbroken except for their own tracks. He walked around the cottage slowly, boots crunching. The back door was also locked. No sign of forced entry. The single chimney stood cold and empty. Inside, they found Angus MacLeod dead in his armchair. The room was neat. A fire had burned low to ash. A cup of tea sat untouched on the table. A thin skin formed across its surface. Angus' face was calm, almost peaceful, but the dark bruise at his throat told another story. He had been strangled, yet nothing was disturbed. No struggle, no overturned chair. The windows were bolted from within. "A locked room," murmured one of the villagers, crossing himself. Hamish said nothing. He moved through the cottage with lazy care, observing. On the mantel stood a row of small wooden carvings boats, birds, a stag. The bed in the adjoining room was neatly made. A clock ticked softly on the wall, its steady rhythm oddly loud. "What about enemies?" Hamish asked. Angus had none. He rarely left Lochdub. He had little money. No family nearby. The doctor estimated the time of death to be late evening. But no one had seen or heard anything unusual. Snow had begun to fall shortly after dusk, covering all tracks. It seemed impossible. As Hamish turned to leave, something caught his attention. On the small table beside the chair lay a scrap of paper. It was torn roughly, as if ripped from a notebook. Upon it was drawn a single symbol, a crescent moon, shaded dark. "Did Angus draw?" Hamish asked. The villagers shook their heads. Hamish studied the symbol. Outside, the clouds shifted, and pale winter light slid through the window. He noticed then that the crescent was not random. The curve was precise, deliberate. And beneath the chair, half hidden in shadow, lay something else, a thin line, etched into the wooden floor, as though a heavy object had been dragged and returned. Hamish straightened slowly. The room felt colder now. This was no simple killing, he said. Outside, the first flakes of a new snowfall began to fall, covering the world again, and Hamish Macbeth knew that somewhere in the quiet Highlands, someone believed they had committed the perfect crime. Hamish remained in the cottage long after the others had begun to drift outside, eager to escape the oppressive stillness of death. The constable had already started his routine questions, his voice loud and official, but Hamish let the sound fade into the background. He preferred silence. Silence let small things speak. He crouched again beside the chair, studying the thin mark in the wooden floor. It ran in a shallow arc, almost invisible unless the light struck it at a certain angle. He placed his fingers along it, measuring the distance, imagining weight and movement. Something heavy had been dragged carefully, slowly, and then returned to its place. Yet the chair itself had not moved. He stood and looked around the room once more, this time with greater patience. The mantel, the clock, the carvings, the tea, everything neat, too neat. Angus had been a simple man, but not fussy. Hamish remembered visits in past winters. The old crofter had always left things slightly out of place, tools on tables, boots near the fire. Now everything was arranged. He moved to the table and lifted the cup. The tea was cold, untouched. He sniffed it. Nothing obvious. Still, he set it down carefully and turned to the scrap of paper again, the crescent moon. Strange thing to draw before dying, he murmured. Behind him, the constable entered, stamping snow from his boots. Doctor says we'll send the body to Inverness. Likely robbery gone wrong. Maybe someone he knew. Nothing's missing, Hamish said mildly. Could be hidden money. Well, search. Hamish nodded absently. His gaze had settled on the carvings. He picked one Yupa small boat, smooth from years of handling. Angus had made them in winter, selling a few to tourists. But one space on the mantel looked slightly different. Dust-marked where something had rested for a long time. Yet now it was gone. Did Angus have more carvings? Hamish asked. Aye, dozens, said the constable. Gave them away. Hamish replaced the boat. This one was here recently. See the dust? Something larger. The constable frowned. So why take a carving and leave everything else? Before the man could answer, voices rose outside. Hamish stepped into the cold air. A young woman stood near the gate, wrapped in a dark coat, her face pale against the snow. She looked as though she had run all the way from the village. Is it true? She asked breathlessly. Angus is dead? Hamish recognised her Fiona Grant, school teacher, newly arrived that autumn. She rarely spoke to anyone beyond polite greetings. Now her hands trembled. I'm afraid so, Hamish said gently. Her eyes moved past him toward the cottage. For a moment something flickered their fear, not grief. When did you last see him? Hamish asked. Yesterday, she said quickly. He brought firewood to the school. He always did that. Did he seem worried? She hesitated. Only a second, but Hamish noticed. No, just quiet. Hamish studied her. Did he mention the moon? The moon? She blinked. No, why would he? Just a thought. Constable interrupted, asking routine questions. Fiona answered, but her gaze kept drifting to the cottage windows. At last she excused herself and hurried away, leaving uneven footprints in the fresh snow. Hamish watched until she disappeared. Then he walked slowly to the edge of the path and looked down. Her footprints had overlapped an older set feint, almost erased by the earlier snowfall, but still visible where the wind had spared them. They led not from the village, but from the hills behind Angus' cottage. Hamish followed the direction with his eyes. The hills rose dark and silent, and above them, through the thinning cloud, the pale winter moon was already visible, though the day was not yet done. Aye, he murmured to himself. You saw something, Miss Grant, or someone. He turned back to the cottage, his mind working steadily. A missing carving, a crescent moon, drag marks, a locked room, and now fear where there should have been sorrow. The perfect crime was beginning to show its first cracks, but the shape of the truth remained hidden, like the moon behind drifting cloud. Hamish did not return to the station at once. Instead, he walked slowly down toward the village, his long stride unhurried, his mind busy. Snow continued to fall in thin, drifting veils, softening the sharp edges of the world. By the time he reached the first row of cottages, the news had already spread. Curtains twitched, doors opened, voices lowered when he passed. He began at the most ordinary Placith grocer's shop. Mrs. Patel stood behind the counter, weighing potatoes. She looked up with a mixture of curiosity and excitement. Terrible thing, Constable. I never liked that cottage. Always too quiet. When did you last see Angus? Hamish asked. Yesterday afternoon. He bought tea. Same as always. Was anyone with him? She shook her head, but he seemed distracted, kept looking at the hills. I asked if the weather would turn, and he said the moon would be bright. She hesitated. Odd thing to say in daylight. Hamish nodded. Did anyone else mention the moon? No, but Fiona Grant came in later. She asked if I had seen Angus. She seemed anxious. Hamish thanked her and left. The falling snow muffled his steps as he crossed to the pub. Inside, warmth and the smell of peat wrapped around him. Several villagers sat close to the fire, their conversations stopping as he entered. The landlord, Archie, wiped a glass. Bad business. Aye, Hamish said. Who was here last night? Most of us. Weather kept folk close. Hamish glanced around. Anyone leave early? A man at the table spoke up. I did. Around 8. Saw light in Angus' window as I passed. Anyone else? Silence. Then another voice. I walked home after 10. No light then. The contradiction hung in the air. Hamish noticed the first man stiffen. You're certain? Hamish asked. Aye? Strange? Hamish said mildly. Doctor places the death late evening? The man shrugged too quickly. Maybe he went to bed early. Hamish let it pass. He turned to Archie. Did Angus come in? No. But he sent a message through the boy. Said he had business. What kind of business? Archie frowned. Didn't say. Hamish thanked them and stepped back into the cold. The contradictions were small, but they formed a pattern. People were remembering differently or choosing to. He walked next to the schoolhouse. The windows glowed with lamplight. Inside, Fiona Grant stood alone, gathering books. She started when she saw him. "I didn't expect you," she said. "Nor I," Hamish replied. "But questions rarely wait." She forced a smile. "I've told you everything. Have you?" He leaned casually against a desk. "Mrs. Patel says you were looking for Angus yesterday." Her hands stilled. "Yes. Why?" "I needed firewood." He had already delivered it. She looked away. "I forgot." Hamish watched her in silence. The room felt suddenly tight. "And you came from the hills today," he added. She froze. "I often walk." "In deep snow?" She said nothing. Hamish moved closer, his voice gentle. "Miss Grant, someone strangled an old man in a locked room. Someone clever. But clever folks still leave traces. You were frightened today. Not surprised. Frightened." Her eyes filled with sudden tears. "You don't understand. Then help me." She shook her head violently. "I can't." "Because you're protecting someone?" "No." "Because you're afraid of someone?" The silence stretched. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows. At last she whispered, "He told me not to speak." "Who?" But she only stared at him, terror widening her eyes. "If I tell you, it will be worse. For you or for him. For everyone." Hamish studied her face. She was not lying about her fear. But fear could come from guilt as easily as from danger. He straightened slowly. "Very well. For now." As he turned to leave, she spoke again, her voice trembling. "Constable, did you find anything in the cottage?" "Only questions." She swallowed. "Did you find the moon?" Hamish paused. "What do you know about it?" Her lips parted, then closed. She shook her head. Nothing. But her eyes had already betrayed her. Hamish stepped out into the night, the pale winter moon now bright above the hills. The village lay quiet, yet beneath its calm surface lies and fear moved like currents under ice. Someone here knew the truth, and someone else was already watching, waiting to see how close he would come. Hamish did not go home. Instead, he walked past the darkened cottages and out toward the edge of the village, where the land opened and the hills began. The moon hung low and white, casting long shadows across the snow. It was the kind of light that revealed shapes but hid meaning. He had always liked such nights. People thought darkness concealed truth, but often it was light that misled. He stopped at the rise, overlooking Angus Cottage. From here he could see the roof, the chimney, the small window where the lamp had once burned. The drag mark beneath the chair returned to his thoughts. Something heavy, something taken and replaced, a missing carving, a crescent moon, and fear. He turned back toward the village, his mind sorting through faces and words. Archie at the pub had said Angus had business. That alone was strange. Angus MacLeod had lived a quiet life, but he had not been poor. The old crofter had sold land years before and kept the money hidden. Many in Lochdub suspected it, though none could prove it. Greed was always a motive even in small places. But if this were robbery, why leave the money? Why take only a carving? Unless the carving was worth more than money. Hamish frowned. He had seen that missing space on the mantel before, larger than the others. Perhaps special, perhaps not wood at all. He changed direction and went to the doctor's house. The light still burned. The doctor opened the door in surprise. "You again? Can this not wait?" "It rarely does," Hamish said mildly. "Tell me, did Angus ever mention valuables?" The doctor hesitated. "Years ago. Said he had something from his father. Wouldn't say what. Old Highland superstition. Thought it brought protection. Protection from what? Didn't say." Hamish nodded slowly. "And last night?" "I was at home. Alone." The answer came too quickly. Hamish noted it but did not press. Everyone in Lochdub guarded their privacy. Yet the doctor's eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward the hills. Another connection. Hamish left and walked to the crofter who had claimed to see the light at 8. The man opened the door reluctantly. "You said you passed Angus Cottage," Hamish began. "Aye. Why that road? It's longer." The man shifted. "Habit. Or because you were meeting someone?" The man's face hardened. "You've no proof." "Not yet." Silence stretched. Then the man muttered, "I was walking, that's all." Hamish studied him. Fear again. Not guilt, not quite. Fear of someone else. He stepped back into the night and let the patterns settle. Fiona frightened, the doctor uneasy, the crofter defensive, Archie withholding something. All different reactions, yet all tied to Angus. Revenge. Angus had been stern in his youth, known to drive hard bargains. Perhaps someone long resentful had waited. Jealousy? Fiona was young, alone, and new to the village. Had Angus opposed something? protected someone or controlled something. Greed, always possible, but none explained the locked room. Hamish stopped in the middle of the road. The moonlight reflected in the snow, bright enough to read by. He replayed the scene in his mind. The chair, the mark, the untouched tea. The tea. If Angus had trusted his visitor, he would have sat calmly, no struggle, strangled suddenly, then the body arranged. The room restored, but how had the killer left? Hamish turned and looked toward the hills again. A slow realization began to form, unsettling and precise. The drag mark might not have been made after the death. It might have been made before. Something had been hidden in that room. Something heavy enough to move. Something that allowed entry. And if so, someone in Lochdub had known of it for years. He began walking again, faster now, the cold biting his face. The motives tangled Todetha money, fear, old secrets, and something deeper tied to the moon. The web was tightening. He could feel it. Somewhere within it stood the killer, confident the crime was perfect. But perfection required control, and control always left traces. And tomorrow, Hamish intended to start breaking those threads, one by one. The next morning, Lochdub woke to a brittle, sunless day. Snow crusted underfoot, sparkling faintly in the weak light, and the air carried the sharp tang of frost. Hamish arrived at the constable's office to find a small crowd gathered around the latest discovery, a leather pouch, buried just beyond the far edge of the loch, half hidden beneath drifted snow. The authorities were triumphant. It contained a handful of coins, a small carved box, and a folded scrap of paper with a hurriedly scrawled message. "It's mine now. Looks like our man was after the money," said the constable, puffing out his chest. "Proof at last." Hamish examined the evidence with polite interest, but he did not share their enthusiasm. The pouch was dirty, the box light and empty except for a few scraps of paper. The scrawl on the note was almost deliberately childish. He turned it over in his fingers. The crescent moon symbol was absent. The handwriting didn't match Angos' neat, precise style. He looked up at the constable, whose grin was spreading like wildfire. "Yes," Hamish said softly. "It seems a tidy solution." The villagers cheered. Newspapers would have a headline by tomorrow, "Mystery of Lochdub solved." And for a moment, the village exhaled, relief spilling into corners that had long held tension. But Hamish's mind felt tight, like a winter wind curling through the hills. Something in the scene did not align. He walked again through the snow toward Angos' cottage. The drag mark beneath the chair, the missing carving, the untouched tea-all spoke of a different story. Whoever had left the pouch had staged it. The heavy object, the locked room, the careful arrangement of the body, it had all been too controlled, too neat, as if the killer wanted someone to find something. But what? And why now? He examined the carved box. The light caught a fine scratch along the interior edge. Too precise to be random, too deliberate to ignore. He tapped the side. A hollow sound answered. There was a compartment, shallow, almost invisible. Inside, a tiny, folded letter. Hamish unfolded it carefully. The words were fewer than 10, typed, precise and unsigned. "The moon reveals all." Hamish's brow furrowed. The pouch, the coins, the scrawled note were a distraction, a false trail to placate the authorities. And someone had waited for the villagers to celebrate before planting it, ensuring the early declaration of success. Clever, audacious, patient. He returned to the village, watching the constable parade the pouch triumphantly. The crowd murmured approval. Even Fiona Grant lingered near the edge, quiet but uneasy. Hamish noticed the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes flicked toward the hills beyond the village. Fear had not left her. "No," Hamish muttered to himself. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Later, inside his small flat above the police office, he spread out the evidence. Coins, papers, the carved box, and the mysterious letter. Every piece hinted at a mind deliberately misleading everyone. The lock, the drag mark, the missing carving, those were the truths that mattered. The pouch and the note were a smokescreen, designed to draw attention and suggest resolution, while the real criminal remained at large. Hamish traced the crescent moon symbol in the letter with his finger. It had appeared before in the scrap in the cottage. That symbol was the key, though its meaning remained opaque. Someone here in Lochdub had used it deliberately, a signature of intent, a calling card, or a warning. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the eaves. The first thin rays of sun touched the hills, yet shadows remained deep in every corner. Hamish knew the criminal was watching, likely laughing at the village's premature victory, and he knew that when the time came, the killer would strike again, testing patience and courage. But Hamish Macbeth was not fooled. He would wait, he would watch, and when the criminal made the next move, he would be ready. The victory declared by others was false, but the true reckoning was only beginning. Hamish stayed at his flat long after the village had quieted, snow piling silently against the window pane. He poured himself a small dram of whiskey and leaned back, letting the warmth chase the chill from his fingers. The crescent moon symbol lingered in his mind, precise and deliberate, and he returned to it again and again. It had a familiarity beyond Angus Cottage, though he could not immediately place it. Then it came to him the old case file he had glanced at weeks ago in the Inverness archives. A theft from 20 years past, from a wealthy Highland family who had owned lands near Loch. The case had been quietly closed, unsolved, but the pattern was there. A crescent carved into a cabinet, a locked room, a body discovered under suspicious circumstances, and a small carved object missing. Hamish had filed it away at the time, thinking it irrelevant, a distant echo of mischief and greed. But now, with Angus, it clicked. The missing carving, the hidden box, the stage Pauk Somione here had remembered that old crime and was using the same methods. The connection had lain dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Hamish left his flat, boots crunching over the snow, heading toward the village library, a modest building that held more than books. He requested old parish records, letters, and notices from the time of that forgotten case. He spread the documents across a table, noting names, addresses, and family ties. One name stood out: Callum Grant, a local farmer who had disappeared from the village shortly after the previous theft. Callum's daughter, Fiona, had recently returned, newly appointed as the schoolteacher. Hamish traced the lineage on a yellowed parish record. Callum Grant had been Angus' contemporary, their families intertwined by land disputes, trade, and old Highland grudges. The theft had left a lingering bitterness in the village, though few remembered the details. Hamish realised that Fiona, though young, carried the legacy of that unresolved tension, and the crescent moon present in both case devoirs not a whimsical symbol. It was a mark of the past, a signature meant to tie the two events together. He also noticed something else. A series of small, carved objects had been mentioned repeatedly in the old case files. Like Angus carvings, they had been overlooked, thought of as trivial, but someone had remembered. Someone had orchestrated the present crime to echo the old one. Outside, the wind began to shift, stirring the loose snow into flurries that danced like ghosts across the streets. Hamish's mind connected dots with growing clarity. The crofter who had been defensive, the doctor who had glanced toward the hills, and even Fianich had a thread running back to the past. Not all motives were equal, but all were informed by memory, grievance, or fear. The crime was not just about greed or opportunity, it was a reckoning rooted in history. Hamish leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The village had celebrated too soon. The pouch and the staged evidence had been a clever ploy, a distraction meant to suggest resolution while the true forces of the past were still in play. Whoever had killed Angus had studied both him and Lochdub's memory carefully, understanding that old wounds could manipulate the living as easily as the dead. He rose, gathering the records into a neat stack. The room felt colder than before, the shadows stretching long under the dim library lights. The past had resurfaced with precision, weaving a dangerous web that implicated more than a single individual. The killer was patient, methodical, and intimately familiar with the village's history. Hamish stepped out into the twilight, snow crunching beneath his boots. Somewhere in the hills, the orchestrator of this intricate plot waited. But now Hamish knew the true skeletons behind the locked room and the hidden carving. They were not just about Angus, they were echoes of old grievances, carefully preserved, and the detective understood that solving this mystery would require untangling the past as much as confronting the present. The wind howled through the village as he walked toward the cottages, mind sharpened. Shadows of the past had awakened, and the truth lay hidden within them, waiting for him to draw it out. Hamish returned to the village under the pale light of late afternoon, the wind scouring the streets and ruffling his coat. He carried no papers this time, no evidence other than the lingering knowledge of history's weight. His mind worked quietly, sorting, probing, and testing. The killer had left a signature, a subtle echo of the past, but human nature was never as careful. People always revealed something when the right questioner, the right situation was presented. He began with Fiona Grant. She was quiet that evening, the schoolhouse darkened except for a single lamp. Hamish knocked softly. She opened the door, her expression tight, wary. "I need your help with something," Hamish said gently, stepping inside. "I've been reviewing old Highland carvings. I'm curious about technique. You saw Angus often, yes? Perhaps you can help me identify a style. Fiona stiffened slightly. I didn't pay much attention. Not to the carvings themselves, Hamish said, pulling a small piece of smooth wood from his pocket, a scrap from the cottage, but to the patterns, the marks. Just a guess. I want to see if you notice what I notice. She hesitated, then took the scrap in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she traced the grain, the tiny carved notches. Hamish watched her closely. She moved deliberately at first, then paused. Her eyes widened, a flicker of something uncontrolled crossing her face. Fear? Guilt? Recognition? You've seen this before, he said softly. No, she whispered almost too quickly. Hamish raised an eyebrow. Not this exact mark. Her hand jerked slightly. The second might have seemed similar, but that's all. He nodded, leaning against the desk. Do you know someone else who might have carved in this way? Someone who worked with Angusa against him? Her lips pressed together, silent. Then she said, voice low, perhaps someone who has a reason to follow the old ways. Old ways? Hamish pressed, leaving the statement deliberately vague. She shook her head. Nothing. Her fingers gripped the wood tightly, knuckles white. Hamish let the silence stretch. Then, in a subtle shift, he asked, if someone came to Angos Cottage the night he died, moved something heavy, and left a note, would they be trying to scare the living or protect something hidden? Fiona's breath caught. She set the wood down, eyes darting to the window. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling. Maybe both, or maybe neither, Hamish said lightly. Perhaps only to confuse. He smiled faintly, letting the suggestion linger. And confusion works best when people are eager to declare victory. Her face paled, the first real crack showing. They were clever, she admitted softly. Very clever. But her voice faltered, and she swallowed. Who? Hamish asked gently, leaning closer. Who was clever? She shook her head violently. I can't. Not yet. Please. Hamish nodded, stepping back. Of course. But your reaction tells me enough. Someone Heracomene you know is tangled in all this. Your instinct has revealed it, even if you won't say the name. She buried her face in her hands. Hamish realised the trick had worked. He had not forced a confession. Not yet. He had merely placed her under subtle pressure, created a situation in which her own fear of the past, of the moon symbol, and of the old grievances betrayed her. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the eaves of the schoolhouse. Hamish stepped into it, hands in his coat pockets. The snow had begun to drift in soft curtains, and in the distance, the hills loomed dark. Somewhere among them, the orchestrator of Angus' murder watched carefully, confident that the villagers' brief victory would hold. But Hamish had seen a crack in the facade, a fissure small but real. And cracks, even the tiniest ones, eventually grow into openings. Hamish returned to the cottage the following morning, the snow now packed into icy ridges along the path. The village seemed quieter than usual, as if even the wind hesitated. Inside, the room smelled faintly of wood smoke and cold air, and he immediately went to the small table where the carved box had been kept. It was gone, not misplaced, not overlooked. Gone. Hamish's heart sank a fraction, not from surprise, but from recognition. Someone had moved it. The carefully hidden compartment, the tiny letter with the typed words "The moon reveals all," had vanished. The pouch, the coins, the false trailet had been planted to distract. But this had been real. Someone had destroyed or stolen it, and now the crucial clue linking the present to the past had been removed. He crouched and examined the table. A faint smear of snow dust suggested the box had been lifted roughly, without care. Not the work of someone calm and deliberate like the killer. This was hurried, impatient. Hamish traced the marks with a gloved finger. Whoever had taken it had acted in the night, unseen by all, leaving only the faintest whisper of evidence. Outside, he noticed footprints in the new snowfall, faint but distinguishable. They led toward the edge of the hills, disappearing into a copse of dark pine trees. Hamish followed carefully, observing the pattern single, heavy boots, quick steps, a slight wobble suggesting someone carrying a weight. Back in the village, he checked with the constable, who was more flustered than usual. The box? Gone? Impossible. It's not impossible, Hamish said quietly. Someone is cleaning up. Someone who wants the past buried, and the present sealed in smoke and mirrors. The constable frowned. Who would do that? Someone clever, patient, and close enough to know what to take without being seen. Hamish spent the afternoon retracing movements, revisiting villagers who had been near the cottage. He watched their faces, studied their responses. Some were too eager to provide alibis. others too quick to dismiss the missing evidence. Every gesture, every hesitation suggested a web of knowledge carefully concealed. Fiona Grant appeared at the edge of the village again, her hands stuffed into her coat pockets, her eyes darting to the hills. Hamish approached her cautiously. "Something's been taken," he said. "Evidence. Someone has removed it." Her face paled. "What? The box?" "Yes, and now the truth is at greater risk than ever." She swallowed, glancing away. I didn't see anyone." "Of course you didn't," Hamish said, "but someone did, and they knew exactly what to remove." Her lips trembled. "Do you think someone knew I might help? Perhaps. Or perhaps they were aware of the connections we're uncovering." Hamish's eyes searched hers, calm and steady. "It's the past haunting the present, Miss Grant, and some would prefer it remain buried." By evening the wind had risen, cutting sharp through the village streets. Hamish walked alone, replaying the day in his mind. The disappearance of the box was no random act, it was a warning, a statement, and a move calculated to delay discovery. Someone was playing a dangerous game, testing patience, measuring trust, and ensuring that even the most careful detective could not rely entirely on the evidence he had gathered. As the first thin moonlight touched the snowy hills, Hamish understood that the stakes had risen. The killer and accomplice was not merely clever, they were active, responsive, and watching. Every clue Hamish found, every connection he unravelled, could be snatched away in an instant. Trust had become a fragile thing, and the detective realised that the battle was no longer simply about solving a murder. It was about staying ahead of a shadow that moved with deliberate cunning, hiding the truth behind layers of fear, silence, and carefully orchestrated disappearance. And somewhere, in the dark hollows of the hills or the quiet streets of Loch, the orchestrator of this deception was smiling, confident that the puzzle might never be fully revealed. But Hamish Macbeth was not so easily deceived. The game had changed, and he knew the next move would be crucial. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the hills bathed in thin sunlight that barely warmed the frozen world. Hamish had scarcely begun retracing the vanished box path when the first urgent knock came at his flat. The constable stood there, cheeks red from the cold, eyes wide with alarm. "Hamish, it's bad. Fiona Grant is gone." Hamish's brow furrowed. "Gone?" "Her cottage, empty, bed unmade, windows open. Snow tracks lead away, but then vanish. No sign of a struggle. She's disappeared into the hills." Hamish pulled his coat tight and stepped outside. The wind scoured the streets, throwing thin veils of snow across the village, and he followed the faint, irregular footprints that led from the edge of the schoolhouse. They meandered toward the pines at the hill's base before fading entirely into the drifted snow. He felt the chill of foreboding tighten around him. The disappearance was not random. Someone had taken Hero. She had fled, but either scenario carried danger. The past had resurfaced with a lethal precision, and the orchestrator of Angos' death had proven themselves once again several steps ahead. Hamish returned quickly to the cottage. The missing carved box, the drag mark beneath the chair, the scrawled crescent moon symbol, everything had pointed toward a methodical mind capable of manipulation. Now it was clear. The killer was not merely covering tracks, they were escalating. The village's brief relief had been a misdirection, and the true danger was still active. He retraced Fiona's likely path along the hillside, noting the way the snow had softened in places, as though Summoner 2 had moved carefully, testing the terrain. At one point he discovered a thin ribbon of fabric caught on a low branch, its dark colour stark against the snow. He recognised the pattern immediately, the edge of Fiona's coat. The presence of the ribbon suggested struggle, or at least haste. Hamish pressed on, mindful of the hidden hollows, the drifted gullies where one misstep could send him sliding into darkness. The hills were steep and silent, and each shadow seemed to watch, waiting. As he paused near a rocky outcrop, a sudden movement caught his eye, a figure disappearing behind a ridge. Hamish moved quietly, heart steady, mind alert. He reached the edge to see a glint of something metallic, a knife lying half buried in snow. Its placement was deliberate, as if left to taunt or mislead. Hamish crouched, brushing snow aside, noting the careful angle and orientation. The knife was new, clean, and unmarked by snow or blood. Someone had planted it recently. A sudden thought struck him. The killer was not simply reactive, he were predicting every step, orchestrating events to test reactions. The pouch, the box, Fiona's disappearance, or parts of a larger plan. The danger was no longer theoretical. Lives were at stake, and the window for discovery was narrowing. Hamish exhaled slowly, turning to the tree line. If Fiona was alive, she was being hidden, watched, moved strategically. If the killer misjudged anything, hesitation, Miss Stepney might leave evidence. The real puzzle had shifted. It was no longer solely about solving Angus' murder. It was about preventing another, about understanding a mind that played a deadly game with patience as its weapon. The wind picked up, whistling between the rocky crags, carrying with it a whisper of threat, and Hamish felt the tension coiling in his chest. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, the orchestrator waited, confident and unseen. Yet Hamish was certain of one thing. The trail was still there, subtle, deliberate, and fraught with danger, but there, and he would follow it. He tightened his gloves, adjusted the strap of his coat, and moved on, every sense alert, every step measured. The unexpected twist had changed the stakes, but Hamish Macbeth did not flinch. The game had grown sharper, more perilous, but the detective's resolve had only hardened. The shadow chasing him was clever, but cleverness alone could not outlast observation, patience, and resolve. Hamish spent the rest of the afternoon retracing every thread he had gathered. The vanished box, the planted pouch, Fiona's disappearance, the glinting knife on the hillside. He returned to the village as twilight began to deepen, the hills etched in long, dark shadows. In the stillness of the office above the constable's station, he spread the day's observations across the table, aligning them like pieces in a puzzle. The pattern did not emerge immediately. It was subtle, hidden beneath layers of misdirection and fear, but Hamish had learned long ago that the smallest, most overlooked details often carried the weight of truth. He picked up the scrap of paper from the first crime scene, a Ganathy crescent moon, darkly shaded, precise in its curve. He traced it with a finger, recalling every moment it had appeared since Angus' murder. The carving, the letter, the offhand comment about the moon from Mrs. Patel, and now Fiona's trembling acknowledgement that the moon reveals all. And then it struck him. It was not the moon itself that mattered, it was the timing. Each incident coincided with a specific phase. The day the pouch was planted, the night of Fiona's disappearance, even the old case decades before. Each event occurred when the moon was visible at a certain angle over the hills, casting shadows into the cottages or down the woodland paths. The killer was not merely leaving a symbol. They were using natural light and shadow as part of the plan, exploiting the environment to manipulate perception, conceal movements, and time actions precisely. Hamish's mind raced through other details that had seemed inconsequential. The crofter's nervous glance toward the hills, the doctor's distracted hesitations, Fiona's repeated references to the hills during questioning. Each minor reaction had been timed with the moon's movement, guiding or constraining the actions of others. Even the misplaced objects, the carved box, the knife, the ribbon from Fiona's coat were now connected in a subtle choreography. The killer had created a sequence, a pattern that unfolded in space and time, each piece designed to mislead or to confirm understanding, depending on who discovered it. The chaos of the village, the celebrations of false victories, the sudden disappearance Sethi were all part of a larger symmetry, deliberately constructed to confuse while revealing a signature to the attentive observer. Hamish leaned back, feeling the quiet satisfaction of recognition. The pattern was precise, audacious, and yet elegant. It had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. Everyone else had seen only fragments, random acts of crime or mischief, but Hamish now understood that the killer had left these breadcrumbs deliberately, trusting that no one would perceive the orchestration. He thought of Fiona, the stolen box, the crescent moon. He understood that the villain's obsession was not only with material gain, but with control. Control over perception, over timing, over fear. Every detail, every subtlety was a test, a manipulation. The past, present, and potential future had been woven together with deliberate care. Outside, snow swirled in the evening wind, catching the last rays of the pale sun. Hamish looked toward the hills, now obscured by drifting white. Somewhere within them, the killer was still at large, confident in the design of their pattern, but Hamish had glimpsed the underlying structure. The chaos had a rhythm, the disorder had form, and once the form was understood, once the pattern was clear, prediction became possible. The next moves of the murderer could be anticipated. The missing box, Fiona's safety, even the final revelation of who orchestrated, everything of it rested on following the pattern now visible to the patient eye. Hamish allowed himself a small, sharp smile. The moon, the shadows, the objectsaw had led him here. The key had been beneath the surface all along, and the detective now held the understanding that could turn uncertainty into insight. The hunt was far from over, but for the first time, Hamish Macbeth felt the advantage swing toward him. Hamish returned to the quiet of his flat that night, snow muffling the village under a soft, oppressive stillness. The moon hung pale and exact above the hills, spilling light over the cottages and reflecting off the icy river. He sat at his desk, the evidence laid before him once more. The carvings, the empty box, the ribbon, the scrap of paper, and the crescent moon symbol repeated in his memory like a refrain. The pattern was clear, the timing precise, but the why remained elusive. He had traced the steps, anticipated the moves, even predicted the manipulations, but the deeper motive had yet to surface. It came not from documents or objects, but from quiet reflection on the people involved. Fiona Grant had been the key to observing reactions, but she had been careful not to lie outright. The crofter's defensiveness, the doctor's nervous glances, the village gossip had circled the edges of a psychological truth. Hamish considered the old case, the theft decades before, the unresolved, grudges, and then the present, Angos' murder, the staged evidence, Fiona's disappearance. And suddenly, the strands of history, fear, and obsession wove together. This was not about money. It was not about land or petty revenge, or even the thrill of criminal cunning. It was about control and, more specifically, the fear of secrets being exposed. The killer's actions were not random, they were a desperate, meticulous effort to bury something long hidden, to prevent knowledge from reaching the light. Hamish recalled the small carved boat that had rested on the mantel, the one that seemed ordinary, but had been replaced. He remembered the careful drag mark beneath the chair, the untouched tea, the faint scrap of paper with the crescent moon. The message, repeated across decades, was the obsession of a mind shaped by secrecy, shaped by shame, and shaped by a desire to dominate not through force, but through fear and manipulation. Then it clicked. The villain had been connected to the old theft, and its aftermath in ways no one suspected. They had carried the bitterness, the sense of injustice, the fear of exposure, forward into the present. Angus had discovered a truth, something that could unravel reputations, destroy lives, or reveal the careful lie that had been maintained for years. The murder, the distraction, the psychological game esthete were all extensions of that obsession, a plan to control not just events, but perception itself. Hamish leaned back in his chair, realizing the scope of the design. The killer's mind had been shaped by a rigid moral code of their own making, where exposure of the truth was intolerable and secrecy was sacred. Every act, every calculated delay, every staged clue had been intended to manipulate others, to provoke, to terrify, and to hide the central truth. Even Fiona's fear, the staged pouch, the planted knife, all served this singular purpose. The villain's psychology was exacting, obsessive, and ruthless. The crime was a manifestation of a deep-seated compulsion to control history, memory, and the fates of those around them. Outside, the moonlight fell across the frozen village, highlighting the contours of the hills where the villain now lurked, confident in their design. Hamish thought of the phrase scribbled in the tiny hidden letter, "The moon reveals all." It was more than a symbol, it was a warning, a philosophy, a guiding principle of a mind that valued the concealment of truth above all else, yet could not resist leaving traces of mastery for those perceptive enough to see. Hamish rose and paced, feeling the weight of understanding settle in his chest. The crime had begun as a simple murder, seemingly motivated by greed or old grudges, but its roots ran deeper into fear, obsession, and the human need to preserve secrets at any cost. This was why the killer had acted with such audacity, leaving behind a pattern, manipulating the villagers and testing the detective. Finally, Hamish sat by the window, eyes on the moonlit hills. The hidden motive had been revealed, shocking in its depth and inhuman precision. It was not mere crime, it was a compulsion, a psychological architecture of fear, secrecy, and dominance. The murderer had acted not just to silence Angus, but to control the narrative of the past and the present. And now, knowing this, Hamish understood that he was no longer simply solving a case, was contending with a mind capable of extraordinary patience and relentless calculation, a mind that could strike again at any moment to protect the secrets it held most dear. Hamish spent the next hours moving quietly through the village, arranging his plan with the patience of a man who had learned that timing and subtlety mattered more than brute force. He left the constable with instructions to watch the obvious routes, while he himself took a less predictable path toward the hills, following the faint traces of snow and shadow left by the villain's earlier movements. Every step he took was measured, his eyes scanning for irregularities. Footprints half covered by drifted snow, a broken twig, the faintest imprint of a boot. By nightfall, Hamish had arrived at a secluded hollow, a natural vantage point overlooking the path that led from the higher hills down toward the village. Here, he knew, The killer would eventually move either to check on their handiwork, recover what had been stolen, or confront anyone who threatened exposure. He positioned himself behind a thick stand of pines, the moonlight cutting through the branches in pale streaks, casting long, shifting shadows across the snow. Every detail was as he had anticipated: the wind direction, the snow drifts, even the occasional cry of a night bird. Hours passed. The village below slept uneasily, unaware that the tension stretched over the hills like a taut wire. Then, moving meant a dark figure slipping across the snow, careful, deliberate. Hamish's breath was steady as he watched the silhouette approach the ridge. The figure paused, glancing around, hands gloved and hidden, eyes scanning the slopes. Hamish stepped forward slowly, his voice calm but carrying across the hollow. "I've been waiting for you." The figure froze, turning sharply. Recognition dawned, then fear. Fiona's disappearance, the stolen box, the staged evidency all pointed to a single, calculating mind. The villain had believed themselves untouchable, patient, always several steps ahead. But Hamish had learned the pattern, anticipated the rhythm of obsession. "You've gone far enough," Hamish continued, keeping his voice even. "Every move, every precaution, every attempt to manipulate the villagate has all been traced. You've been clever, yes, but cleverness leaves footprints, if one knows where to look." The figure hesitated, then spoke, voice low and tight. "You don't understand. None of you understand what must be protected." "I understand more than you think," Hamish replied. "The obsession, the fear, the compulsion to hide the past, it's clear now. But secrecy cannot outrun justice forever. Anger's death, the patterns, the least the end tonight." The villain took a step backward, hands twitching towards something concealed under the coat. A knife? A weapon? Hamish remained composed, tone steady, eyes never leaving the figure. "There's no need for more harm. You've been found out. You can surrender now, or the consequences will be unavoidable." A harsh laugh cut the stillness. "You think you can stop it? You think understanding me changes anything? You've seen the pattern, but you don't feel the necessity." Hamish advanced one measured step, the snow crunching underfoot. "I feel it, but your necessity does not justify murder. Not here, not ever. The truth is stronger than fear." The villain's hands shook. They glanced toward the shadows behind the trees, calculating escape, but the hollow left no cover. Their resolve wavered, a desperate move, and the accumulated patience of years, the careful orchestration of every misdirection, would unravel instantly. Then, almost imperceptibly, the figure dropped their shoulders. The tension, the defiance, the control-thea all cracked. A confession trembled on their lips, a mixture of fear, relief, and acknowledgement. I had to protect it. The past, they would have destroyed everything." Hamish nodded, voice soft but firm. "You cannot protect the past with murder, but you can do the right thing now. Surrender. Let the village see the truth, and let the story end without further blood." For a moment the wind whipped through the hollow, carrying the scent of snow and pine. The figure stood trembling, torn between desperation and inevitability. And then, finally, they lowered their hands completely, resignation bleeding into their posture. Hamish stepped closer, carefully retrieving the stolen box and the hidden letter, securing the last tangible pieces of the case. The confrontation had reached its peak, and the careful mind that had orchestrated so much could no longer resist the weight of exposure. Hamish Macbeth remained composed, knowing that after years of observation, deduction, and patience, the web of secrets, fear, and obsession had finally been untangled. The night held its breath, and the game, so long dominated by fear and shadows, had ended in the stillness of truth. The village below was quiet, the snow glinting faintly under the pale moonlight, and Hamish felt a rare moment of satisfaction. The villain's confession had revealed the obsession, the compulsion, the driving force behind Angos's death. Fiona had been found, unharmed but shaken, and the stolen box and hidden letter were safely recovered. The constable would soon arrive to take the culprit into custody. It seemed, for the first time since the murder, that Loch could breathe again. Yet Hamish's instincts, honed over years of observing human folly and cunning, remained alert. There was something off, a subtle irregularity that pricked at the edges of his awareness. The confession had been complete, the motive exposed, but his mind would not rest. He examined the letter again, the delicate folds, the typed words, and the crescent moon. He noted every mark, every indentation, and a chill ran down his spine. Fiona, sitting nearby, held herself stiffly, eyes darting toward the hills. "It's finally over, isn't it?" she whispered. "Perhaps," Hamish said, voice calm. but sometimes what seems over is only the beginning of another layer. He turned the box over in his hands, inspecting the hidden compartment once more. It was empty, just as before, yet the surface felt subtly scratched in a way that suggested repeated handling. And then he noticed it, a faint impression beneath the interior lining, almost invisible unless held to the light. Letters, tiny, deliberate, as though someone had written in pencil and erased it carefully. Hamish leaned closer, eyes narrowing. He traced the shapes and abbreviation, a name, almost imperceptible, A.M. He froze. That was not the confessed villain's mark. That was another signature, one deliberately hidden, one that had guided events from the shadows. The one who had orchestrated everything, every stage clue, every manipulation, every psychological test was still out there, watching, controlling. The admitted killer had acted, but someone else had engineered the sequence of events, shaping panic, fear, and observation like a conductor with a symphony. Hamish's mind raced, reconstructing the chain of events with the new information. The old case, the pattern of the moon, the timing, the stolen evidential had been set up with precision that far exceeded the confessed villain's temperament. Cleverness, patience, and audacity had left subtle fingerprints, and the detective now recognized them. A second mind at work, calculating, deliberate, and unseen. He turned toward Fiona. "You were not just a witness," he said softly, "and neither was anyone else as innocent as they appeared. Someone has been directing all this from behind the scenes, confident that their role would remain hidden, even if their accomplice was caught." Her eyes widened, terror mingled with confusion. Who could it be?" Hamish shook his head slowly. "I do not know yet, but this changes everything. The confessed villain was a piece in a larger design, and if we are to prevent further harm, we must find the true mastermind before they strike again." Outside, the wind rose, sweeping through the village, rustling roofs and rattling shutters. The hills loomed, pale under the moon, hiding secrets that had manipulated life and death below. Hamish tightened his coat and adjusted his gloves. Every sense alert. The game was not over. The apparent resolution had been an illusion, a clever diversion by someone who remained several steps ahead, and the true genius of the crime had yet to be confronted. He moved toward the village edge, boots crunching on the hard-packed snow, mind sharp and eyes scanning. The final twist had appeared, unexpected and unnerving, and Hamish Macbeth understood that his genius, patience and courage would be tested once more. Somewhere, in the shadows of Loch and the hills beyond, the real orchestrator waited, confident that the story would never reach them. But Hamish had seen the sign the imperceptible tries, and he knew that even the most careful shadows could not hide forever. Hamish moved through the village at dawn, the snow softened by the first weak light of morning. The confessed killer had been taken into custody, the constable handling the arrest with a mixture of relief and pride. Yet the unease that had gnawed at Hamish since discovering the faint inscription in the box had not abated. Somewhere, the true orchestrator of Angus' death and the carefully staged chaos remained free, watching, patient, and confident that their role would never be exposed. He returned to the hollow where he had first confronted the confessed villain, retracing each step, inspecting the snow, the rocks, the sparse pines. Hamish examined the footprints again, noting their subtle overlaps, the faintly heavier impressions that suggested a second presence. It had been deliberate, calculated. The confessed killer was guided, manipulated, every move choreographed to maintain the illusion of randomness. The second mind mastermind had orchestrated everything with uncanny precision, leaving only the tiniest, nearly imperceptible signs for those perceptive enough to notice. Hamish called Fiona over, now recovered and steady, and they walked together slowly through the village streets. Most people, he said, saw only what was in plain view: the missing box, the crescent symbol, the sequence of disappearances. Even the confession seemed to explain everything. But cleverness, when coupled with obsession, leaves faint traces. The faint impression in the box, the minute overlap of footprints, and the timing of events with the moon thieves were all left deliberately to reveal a pattern without exposing the hand behind it. Fiona listened intently, shivering slightly in the cold morning air. "So the person who manipulated all of this, they are still out there?" "Yes," Hamish replied. "The confessed killer was a piece on the board, someone willing to act when directed. The real mind one shaping events, planting clues, controlling the temperamanes at large. But their methods reveal their nature. They are careful, patient, and obsessed with secrecy, yet even the most meticulous cannot erase all evidence. Subtle overlaps, inconsistencies, and traces of deliberate timing betray them to a trained eye." He gestured toward the hills, snow white and imposing under the soft dawn. Notice the way the moon aligned with each event, casting shadows that guided actions or concealed them. The original theft decades ago, the murder of Angus, the disappearance of Fionathy, all followed this hidden rhythm. The pattern was always there for those who knew how to read it. Most saw only chaos. We have seen the design. As they walked back toward the village centre, the sun broke fully over the horizon, glinting on icy rooftops. Hamish felt the weight of the resolution tempered by the lingering unease. Justice had been delivered in part, but the mastermind's escape left a shadow over the village. The confessed villain would answer for their actions, but the true orchestrator of this intricate scheme remained a ghost in the landscape, patient and unseen. Fiona glanced at him, understanding dawning. "So, we solved the case, but not entirely." "Exactly," Hamish said. "We have exposed the immediate threat, revealed the motives and rescued those in danger, but the final pieceth mind that orchestrated everything is still at large. That is the nature of justice and human cunning. Sometimes it is partial, sometimes it is delayed, and sometimes it leaves an unsettling sense that the story is not fully over. Yet every clue left behind patterns, the subtle sign-sayer proof that with patience and observation, no deception is beyond detection forever." He paused at the edge of the village, looking toward the hills once more. The confessed villain has been caught, the immediate danger resolved, but the shadows remain. And the truth, while partially revealed, serves as a reminder. There are minds capable of great cunning, and even when justice is served, it is never complete until the hidden hand is unmasked. With that, Hamish adjusted his coat, exhaled slowly into the crisp air, and began the careful walk back toward the cottages. The village of Loch could sleep a little easier for now, but Hamish knew that vigilance, insight, and patience would always be required. The mastermind might have escaped this time, but Hamish Macbeth had already traced the faintest of signs, and he would not be outdone again. Hamish walked slowly through the village streets, the crisp air biting at his cheeks, the sun glinting on the snow-covered roofs. The constable had returned to the station with the confessed killer in tow, and villagers were beginning to emerge cautiously from their cottages, murmuring about relief, resolution, and the end of a long, tense chapter. Fiona walked beside him, her hands stuffed in her coat pockets, silent but steady now. The immediate danger had passed, yet Hamish felt the familiar tingle of unease the detective's instinct that not everything was as it seemed. He paused near the edge of the frozen river, glancing at the hills that had loomed over Loch for centuries. The snow drifted in delicate swirls, masking footprints, erasing some traces while preserving others. Hamish squinted, following subtle ridges and depressions, noticing again the faint overlap of impressions, the careful avoidance of certain areas. His mind ticked through the sequence of events. The missing box, the planted knife, the moonlight pattern, Fiona's fear, the confessed villain's carefully orchestrated moves, and the subtle clues that suggested a second unseen hand. He reached into his coat pocket and drew out the folded letter once more. It had been recovered intact, yet even now, he noticed the faintest smudge along the edge, an almost imperceptible mark, not made by the confessed villain. His brow furrowed. Someone else had handled this, someone who knew precisely how to manipulate perception, planting a trace subtle enough to escape ordinary scrutiny, but deliberate enough to challenge the observant mind. The mastermind had left a breadcrumb, a signature only Hamish could read. Fiona glanced at him. "Do you think they'll strike again?" she asked softly, her voice tentative. "Perhaps," Hamish replied, folding the letter carefully. Cunning minds like this rarely rest. They plan, observe, and wait for the smallest opportunity. But they also leave patterns, small openings, and the faintest traces. It is only a matter of time before the signs reveal themselves again. As they continued along the riverbank, Hamish noticed a small, peculiar detail that had gone unnoticed before. A fragment of wood, smooth and polished, caught in the frost along the bank. He picked it up, examining it closely. It was not part of the stolen box or the carvings, yet it bore a faint crescent-shaped mark similar to those left by the killer. It was tiny, almost dismissible, yet its placement felt deliberate, as though someone intended it to be discovered eventually. A message, perhaps, or a warning. Hamish let the fragment fall back onto the snow, his mind working through the implications. The mastermind's presence was still a shadow, a ghost in the village, leaving subtle reminders of their cleverness. Justice had been served in part, but the broader puzzle remained unresolved. The confession, the arrest, the evidence that he had answered many questions, yet left one lingering. Who truly controlled the sequence? Who had orchestrated every manipulation from the shadows, and what might come next? Fiona watched him, curiosity and anxiety mingling in her expression. "Do you think we'll ever know?" Hamish smiled faintly, the faintest curl of satisfaction and restraint. Perhaps. Or perhaps some mysteries are meant to linger, to keep the mind sharp and the heart attentive. What matters is that we understand enough to act when the signs appear. And when they do, we will be ready. The wind picked up, scattering snowflakes in thin curtains over the frozen river. Hamish adjusted his coat, glancing once more toward the distant hills, their outlines softened by mist and morning light. Somewhere up there the mastermind watched, patient, calculating, confident that the story seemed concluded. Yet Hamish knew that subtle patterns never lie, and the faintest trace could always reveal a path. He turned, walking back toward the village centre, Fiona beside him, the villagers beginning to resume their daily routines. The case of Angus' death, the stolen box, the moonlit pattern-saw had been resolved, yet the fragment of wood, the subtle smudge, and the lingering shadow reminded him that mysteries rarely end completely. In Loch, the snow would settle, but curiosity, vigilance, and the unseen hand of cunning minds ensured that the next puzzle was never far away. And Hamish Macbeth, with his keen eyes and patient mind, would be ready to unravel it, one trace at a time.